So what we want to do is we want to see if we have any entities out there around the world where it would be really obvious for the SEC to find something to show that there's a problem. Okay, so we want to make sure that our journal entry, our whole general ledger is safe and like everything in there looks normal. Okay, so and that's something that we can do on a one-pager for the FCPA. And so what we want to do is we're going to gather up all of the information from around SAP, and we want to find out, we're going to use that information to flag our general ledger, and it's going to help us to know if we have postings that are a bit strange. So for example, I've put some examples here, like supplier posting for suppliers that are generic. So you can have generic suppliers, like, you know, sometimes you see in the database, it's like supplier 1, supplier 2, or generic, or it could just be like fournisseur if it's in French, or whatever. It's like a generic supplier, it's not a real name. And sometimes it's just called one-time vendor or vendor for office equipment or something like that. So sometimes companies will put in these generic vendors, and it's just basically because they haven't got time to write in all the tiny little vendors. So they just use one-time vendor account or something like that, which is completely normal. But what's not completely normal is when you have those kind of vendors and then you've got like $20 million for that particular vendor. That would not be normal. And the same is for customers. So for example, customers, you can have generic customers as well. And you might be doing rebates, you know, you might be paying out rebates to customers, or you might have customer returns. There's quite a lot of reasons actually why you might actually give money to a customer. People always think customers, there's no risk in customers because there's a customer giving us money, but actually quite a lot of the time we're giving the customer back money. So we want to make sure that we are not giving a huge amount of money to a customer that's generic, because if it's generic, it's obviously not real, and it means there's no tax number, there's no real address, and we can't trace it back to a particular third party. So if the SEC show up and they see that you've got like $50 million payment to a one-time vendor, it's going to be a huge red flag, and they're going to start digging and digging and digging and find out what that is all about, because probably it's not normal, right? And then maybe that's something that's being used for a bribe. So another thing that they're going to do is material postings that are generic. And it's the same principle. It's like if you've got a generic material posting, it can be normal. But if it's like, maybe you've got a material code, it's just like consulting, and all it says is consulting. And then you've got like $100 million buying consulting. That's not normal. Okay, so you don't want to have like really generic material codes and huge amounts to those ones. So we want to be able to pick those up. And it's going to be quite tricky sometimes to be able to know, like, is that supplier a generic supplier, a one-time vendor? Is that customer generic, or is it a one-time vendor? And the same for materials. But actually in SAP, we have ways of knowing, and different ways of knowing. Is like, one way is that there is actually a flag on the supplier database that will tell us that it's a one-time vendor, and the same for the customer. And the same for materials. So materials, there is also a flag to say it's generic, but it might be quite tricky even if we have those flags. So sometimes we need to do other things. For example, we might want to look in the list of payments. We want to see, like, do we have suppliers that lots of different supplier names, but we have the same bank account, for example. Or it might be that we have a supplier number. It would rather be that we have a supplier number that is actually used for lots of different bank accounts. Sorry, it's that way around. So if you have, like, I don't know, supplier Joe Blogs, and supplier Joe Blogs looks like a normal supplier, like doesn't look like a one-time vendor. It doesn't have the name generic, and it doesn't have the flag generic in SAP because no one wanted anyone to see that it's generic. But it's called supplier Blogs, and it is having a lot of different bank account numbers in the payment program. So actually what it means is that that is a name that is used as a generic supplier. And that's also another way that we can find out if we've got generic suppliers, and the same for customers. And for materials, it could be like, you know, if you've got a material number, and that material number is used for a whole load of different prices, huge ranges of values and different things, then it's probably something that's generic. So there are ways, official ways in SAP to know if it's generic, and then there are other like tricks that you can use to know if it's generic. Then we want to know, obviously, if something is manual. So if something is manual, it means basically that somebody is posting directly into the general ledger. It means that they are not going through the purchasing module, they're not going through the sales and distribution module, and they're not going through payroll, whatever it is. They're just writing the journal entry directly into the general ledger. And if they do that, then it means that they don't have so much control. So for example, maybe you have a lot of like purchase of raw material, for example, you're like buying a huge amount of raw material all the time. And there's a process for that. So you got your purchase order, you got your approvals, you got your goods receipts, you got your invoices, all of that for raw materials. And you're going through this process. And in your process, your supply chain process, you have controls. You've got controls on the prices, you've got controls on the suppliers that you want to use, you've got approbation limits, you've got all of the delegation of authorities and the approbations that are tracked in SAP. And then you've got, when the goods arrive, you've got a three-way match control that's done before you're going to pay that invoice. So you've got all these controls, and these controls are for the most part, they are happening in the materials management module of SAP, right? So it's happening in the materials management module. And these controls are not happening if you're just going to enter the supply invoice straight into the general ledger. So if you bypass the materials management module and just enter that journal entry straight into the general ledger, and that way you don't have to go through all of the delegation of authorities, and you don't have to care about the processing or like, you know, if the supplier has been blocked or cancelled or whatever it is. And the same goes for order to cash. So it can also be an order to cash, you know, that maybe you want to bribe somebody by just giving them a whole lot of free products. So if you're in fast moving consumer goods, it might want to be that you can give an official a huge amount of free products. And if that's happening, then it can be considered to be a bribe. You know, like even if you're in alcohol and beverages, or it could be that you're in clothes or jewelry or anything that's to do with fast moving consumer goods, there's a really huge risk of giving away too many free products and those free products being considered to be a bribe because you're giving away. And it could also be that you're giving away stuff too cheaply. And if you're doing that, it's also a problem. So if people don't want to go through, maybe they don't want to go through all of the customer pricing controls and margin controls that we have the possibility to set up in the sales and distribution module of SAP. So if somebody doesn't want to go through all of those controls, what they can do is they can just enter a journal entry directly into the general ledger. And this is manual journal. This is why manual journal entries is so important. So I want to make sure that we know what all of our manual journal entries are about. Okay, so you want to be able to, on your FCPA one page, you want to be able to filter on manual journal entries. And then you want to be able to see what people are posting that is manual. And we're going to show you later. So we're going to give you the free one-pager FCPA dashboard for SAP, and in there you're going to get all the logic. So it's like really exciting. You know, if you don't know yet how to know if something is a manual journal entry, you're going to find out because we put it in there. And it's like it takes us so long to get all of this information. It's been like years and years and years, over 20 years working on all this stuff, and now we've got all this knowledge. Helps us to know all these things, all these little bits and pieces about SAP, like how do you know if it's a manual journal entry? And I've seen like people doing it in so many millions of different ways. And after a while, you know, you do it and then do it again, you test it and you do it again, and you test it and do it again. And at the end of the day, you sort of work it out. And there's like maybe 20 or 30 different fields you have to take into consideration. Then you get to the correct result of like, that's a manual journal entry. And pretty much in all SAP systems, manual journal entry. So even if you have different SAP system, in Germany compared to what you have in Africa, it's still going to be manual journal entry pretty much. So this really helpful, like I think it's going to really help you to see really quickly all your manual journal entries. And obviously when you get a manual journal entry, it can be totally normal, like, you know, it can be totally normal. But if you're having manual journal entries for things that are like raw materials and stuff like that, then it's not normal, right? So that's the kind of thing that you want to check out. Be like, why am I actually having a manual journal entry for raw materials and it's not going through materials management? Probably it's because somebody wants to get around the internal controls. And this is the type of thing that the guys from SEC would want to have a look at. So if they see manual journal entry for raw materials, and then they want to see like, you know, why was that done and what happened? And is it because you're giving them away for like, or you're buying them at a much higher rate than usual? And so that's maybe why someone wants to get around their internal controls. So they start looking at the prices and all that stuff. So it's also like looking at the prices is also a thing that we want to do in order to see what is going on in terms of FCPA and things like that. Okay, so we want to look for supplier postings that don't have supporting purchasing documents, that's when we talk about manual journal entries, and the same with customer postings. And then also for fixed assets, like if you have fixed assets, you have fixed asset write-off, like maybe you got a fixed asset, it's going on over time and it's depreciating as normal, and then somebody just writes it off, or it could be like you get your fixed asset, quite a huge value, like maybe it's a Maserati car or something like that. So it's an expensive version of your asset class, and it gets acquired and then it gets written off the next day. Now, if that happens, it's obviously a huge red flag. So what you want to look for in your general ledger is the fixed assets that arrive and then they disappear. And that can obviously also be in the fixed assets ledger and in the fixed assets module of SAP, or it can be a manual journal entry. So again, if people are doing manual journal entries about fixed assets, then that's also something that we want to look at. So if you've got fixed assets that are being written off and it's being done by manual journal entry and it's for a big amount, it's something you want to have a quick look at, right? Typically what you do is you get that post and you're like 10 million write-off fixed asset, and then you go into SAP, have a quick look, and you see when was the asset acquired, and if it was last week and then just written it off, obviously it got a big question. Another thing is really typical when we're talking about corruption, because corruption, like people always tell me like, nah, you can't do any data analytics for corruption, it doesn't work. I'm like, wait, and they're like, yeah, because it's under the table, it's like the hidden envelope, it's like the suitcase, you can't actually see that with data analytics. And actually, what I always say to people in response to that is like, if you're an employee and you want to bribe your customer because maybe you want to get a better commission or you want to help the company, because you're in a foreign country and you want to help the company and everyone's doing that anyway, and you want to help the company, get the foothold in that foreign country and like win all the deals and stuff. And you've got to do it because your competitors are doing all the corruption as well. So like, so if you don't do it, then like, you're not going to get anywhere, right? So you really want to help the company, but you're an employee, it's not your company. So you're not really going to like dig in your pockets and bring out like $20 million to give to a government official, right? Because first of all, you probably haven't got that much money. And secondly, who's that dedicated to their employer? Let's face it. So you're not going to do that. But what you might do is find a way to get the money out of the company and give it to that government official. And there's lots of different ways. It can be like, ghost employees, all these other things we're talking about, or it can also be just, travel and expense. So if you've got fake travel and expense, there's also a huge red flag. So typically we look at, normally companies going to have a travel and expense system such as Concur or something. And in the Concur system, there's going to be controls, just like we're talking about with the sales and distribution module and materials management module for purchasing in SAP. In the Concur travel and expense system, you're going to have all of your controls. You've got people working with that system as well. So when somebody goes on a trip, then they're going to have a flight, and then they're going to give the receipt to somebody, and that admin person is going to enter it into Concur, and they're going to check that all the amounts are correct, there's no duplicates, and there's this and that. And it's like a specialized travel and expense system and process to make sure that we don't have any fraud going on, right? No duplication, and everything is normal, and people are respecting the group guidelines for travel. They're not taking like first class if they're not supposed to take first class and all this kind of stuff. So if you want to get around all of that stuff about travel and expense, what you're going to do is you're going to enter a manual journal entry for travel and expense. So if you enter a manual journal entry for travel and expense, it's not going to go through Concur. It's just a journal entry. I was reading a book recently about fraud data analytics for SAP. And in the book, they're talking about journal entries, like the part about journal entry testing. And he says, basically, you can do whatever you like, in the general ledger. You can do anything. Like, you want to take money out of the bank, all you got to do is make sure the general ledger is going to match the bank statement. So how do you do that? You just post a manual journal entry for bank out, and that's all you need to do. So we really need to check all of these flags. And just talking about the one, if somebody just wants to post something out of the bank. So what does that mean? So I've got my whiteboard over here. I'm going to show you something over here. So what we want to check is if we've got some strange accounting schemes. Okay, so maybe you've got some strange accounting schemes, and there's typically some of the things that the SEC would check for immediately is like, what kind of accounting schemes have they got in the general ledger? And if they've got anything that looks really weird, right? So typically, if you're going to have a normal supplier invoice, what you're going to do, you've got debit and credit here. And what you're going to do is you're going to say, I'm going to have a normal supplier invoice. So my supplier invoice, let's move this bit because it's got reflection. Okay, so my supplier invoice is going to be credit the supplier, and then I'm going to debit cost and tax. That's my supplier invoice. And then when I'm going to pay my supplier, what I'm going to do is I'm going to debit the supplier, and then I'm going to credit the bank. And this over here is going to be my bank out. This is when I'm actually paying the guy over here. All right, paying. So we got two journal entries going on here. Two nice normal journal entries. First one, it's our invoice, and the second one, it's our bank out. And these two things, they're going to be linked together. And they're going to be linked together by a clearing document number. Clearing document. So if I'm the SEC and I come along and I want to check all your bank outs, so maybe I go into your general ledger and I'm going to say, I'm going to get all of the journal entries that are for bank out. And that's really easy, you know, because in SAP, you can easily see if the general ledger account has got something to do with the bank. So you get all your bank out, and then you see what have I got on the other side, like who am I doing bank out to? And I also can see, is all of my bank out cleared? Means like, is it matched to something? And if it's matched to something, then I know that there is a reason for the bank out and it makes sense, right? But, and obviously I could look into it in more detail, but I'm going to look for the really odd things. So what about if I had a bank out? First thing that might look for is like bank out, but there's no clearing document. There's no clearing document. That's going to be a problem. If your clearing document number is blank, even though you're talking about a bank out, that's a big red flag. But also another big red flag is our accounting scheme. So what we want to make sure is, like, on the debit side, what do we have? So instead of having a supplier, maybe we have something a bit strange, like cost. Now, you might be thinking, well, I don't care, you know, because I was in Bolivia recently and we're doing this audit, and we had a load of these bank out cost transactions, and I was like, oh, that looks interesting. I'm really excited about that one because maybe that's a huge audit finding, you know, for Bolivia. And actually what it turned out to be is like all of these cost accounts were actually foreign exchange. And so the CFO was like, nah, I don't care about that. That's just foreign exchange adjustments. And I was like, wow, you've got a huge amount of foreign exchange adjustments on the bank. Unfortunately, didn't have the time to actually go through all those foreign exchange adjustments and check that they are real foreign exchange adjustments, because that would have taken too long and only had like a week to do the project, right? So couldn't go in and recalculate all the foreign exchange adjustments, but they were basically like, we have credit bank and debit cost, but it's all foreign exchange adjustments, so we don't care. But if it's not foreign exchange adjustments, and this is something that I've seen other places, is actually just cost, for example, cost sundry. So what does that mean? Cost to sundry, or sundry cost account, it basically means it's like generic or sort of cost, but we don't know what it's about, right? It's just random costs, let's say random costs. So if you got random costs and you've got bank out, in that case, it's really suspicious, right? You see something like that, you're going to get really excited about it because it could be a huge audit finding. So this one, I get a huge, great big question mark. This is the kind of thing I'm really excited about if I'm doing an audit and I want to see that they're not compliant with FCPA, or I want to find out if they're compliant with FCPA. I want to help them to know that if the SEC comes and they see this kind of thing, that they might have a problem, right? So we're helping them. So anyway, if you see something like that, you're really excited because it's probably something you can put on your audit report. And also another thing, if you see something where it's like 10 million all around amount, you know, and you got these kind of things going on, so what is that? You know, what is that? This is an accounting scheme. It's like credit bank, debit cost sundry. This is what we call a general ledger accounting scheme. Basically what it means is it's the pattern. A general ledger accounting scheme is the pattern. It's like, what do we debit, what do we credit in terms of accounts, right? And if we have dodgy patterns like that, that's the kind of thing we want to flag. So in our FCPA one-pager for data analytics, for the audit team, what we want to do is we want to see all of the journal entry patterns. We want to be able to filter on them, and we want to be able to see straight away whether or not I have bank out with cost. And if I do, then there's something I want to have a look at, and I want to see all the detail for those kind of things straight away, right? And there's lots of other things you want to see as well. Like you might want to see, maybe I credit the customer and I have cost sundry. That would also be very strange. Same with assets. Maybe you credit the asset and you cost of sundry. Like it could be that you have a state-owned enterprise that's a customer. You want to do them a favor because you want to get some strategic advantage or something like that. So you just write off their debt. And writing off a customer debt is kind of the same thing as giving them a whole lot of cash. And it can be considered as a bribe as well. So we want to be careful about these journal entry accounting schemes. And it's the journal entry accounting schemes that we want to be able to check.